Welcome back, dear listener. If you have joined us from part one, you already carry with you a deep understanding of what truly is. It's three great phases of desire, decision, and action, and the ultimate that lies at the very core of the self. If this is your first time joining us, you are most welcome here. And we gently encourage you after this recording to go back and listen to part one, because what you are about to hear builds upon that foundation in ways that will move and inspire you, because in part two, we move from the nature of will into its power. William Walker Atkinson now turns his eye from theory to testimony. He is no longer simply explaining what will is. He is showing us what will does, what is done in the lives of real human beings who face real obstacles, real poverty, real ridicule, real defeat, and who refused, through the sheer power of a cultivated and committed will, to be stopped. He shows us will in its most resolute form, in its most persistent form, in its most quietly powerful form, working beneath the surface of consciousness in the great subconscious depths. And by the time this part is finished, you will not merely understand will intellectually, you will feel it. So let us begin. The resolute will. There is a kind of will that does not merely want, that does not merely decide, that does not merely act once and stop. There's a kind of will that burns, that holds steady in the face of every possible discouragement, every possible loss, every conceivable reason to give up, and simply does not yield. Atkinson calls this the resolute will. And to illustrate it, he reaches back into history and gives us one of the most extraordinary stories of human persistence ever recorded, the story of Bernard Palissy. Bernard Palissy was a French potter who, in the 16th century, became consumed by a single obsession: to discover the secret of making fine white enamel for pottery. He had seen pieces of Italian enameled ware and could not rest until he knew how it was made, and so began a journey that would last not months, but years, a journey of such relentless, almost incomprehensible persistence that even today it stands as one of the great monuments to what the human will is capable of when it is fully committed. He set up his furnace. He mixed compounds. He fired and failed. He adjusted and fired again, and failed again, and again. He had no money to buy proper fuel. He burned his own garden fencing to keep the fires going. When the fencing was gone and the enamel still had not melted, he turned to the household furniture, and then his family, hearing the crash and splintering of the tables and shelves being broken apart and hurled into the furnace, ran screaming to the town, crying that poor Palissy had gone mad, that he was burning the very furniture for firewood, that he had lost his mind entirely. He had been at this for weeks without rest. His shirt had not been off his back for a month. He was wasted with toil and anxiety and sleeplessness and want of food. He was drowning in debt and seemed to stand on the very edge of ruin. And then, in that last desperate burst of heat, with the household shelving burning in the furnace and his wife and children sobbing in the street outside, the enamel melted. When the furnace cooled and he drew out the pots, they were covered with a perfect white glaze. He had done it, but this, Atkinson reminds us, was not the end. It was only the end of one period of struggle. Another lay immediately before him. He had discovered the enamel. Now he had to perfect the means of making the ware. He had no money. On one occasion, he had to take the very clothes from his back to pay a helper. His new furnaces cracked and failed, and years more were spent building and rebuilding them. His family and friends kept up their reproaches. His body grew thin and hollowed out. His calves shrunk so much, he once said, that his garters would no longer hold up his stockings and slip down around his ankles. Often he was forced to stop his work entirely just to earn enough bread to feed his family. It took him 10 years to discover the enamel. It took him 8 years more to perfect the method of making his ware. And later in his life, when he looked back on those years and described what it endured, he spoke not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet, hard-won dignity. He spoke of nights at the mercy of the wind and rain, tending his open furnaces alone, with no shelter, no help, no consolation, only the wailing of cats on one side and the howling of dogs on the other. He spoke of tempests so fierce that he was driven indoors, drenched and stumbling through the dark, reeling from one side to the other as if drunk, but in truth only exhausted beyond the limits of what any ordinary man would have been able to bear, and of returning to his house to find not rest, but a second kind of storm, the grief and anger of family who could not understand what drove him, who saw only a man destroying everything around him in pursuit of something no one else believed in, and yet he held on, and he won. Specimens of his were now command prices that placed him among gems. He became the royal potter of France and was lodged in the royal palace. Fate could not dominate a will like his. His was the will, as Atkinson says, which makes its own fate. When you wish for a symbol of the resolute will, think of Bernard Palissy. Now, Atkinson does not leave us only with Palissy's story. He reaches to the words of thinkers and writers who have tried to capture in language what this quality of resolute will truly is and truly does. John Stuart Mill said it plainly and perfectly. A character is a completely fashioned will, not intelligence, not talent, not education. A character, a genuine, reliable, admirable human character, is a will that has been deliberately, carefully, completely shaped. Another writer put it this way: he who is silent is forgotten. He who does not advance falls back. He who stops is overwhelmed, distanced, crushed. He who ceases to become greater becomes smaller. He who leaves off gives up. The stationary is the beginning of the end. It precedes death. To live is to achieve, to will without ceasing. These are not comfortable words, but they are true words, and they are words that the person of resolute will does not merely read and forget. They are words that such a person feels in the bones, that settle into the marrow as a kind of quiet, permanent conviction. Martin wrote of this with tremendous force. Energy of will, self-originating force, is the soul of every great character. Where it is, there is life. Where it is not, there is faintness, helplessness, and despondency. The achievements of willpower are almost beyond computation. Scarcely anything seems impossible to the person who can will strongly enough and long enough. One talent with will behind it will accomplish more than 10 without it. As a thimbleful of powder in a rifle, whose barrel gives a direction, will do greater execution than a carload burned in the open air. When image, that is, the powder is the talent. The rifle barrel is the will, giving it direction, focus, penetrating force. Without the barrel, the powder simply burns and scatters, spectacular for a moment and immediately forgotten. With the barrel, even a thimbleful becomes unstoppable. Fothergill adds something equally important. Willpower enables a person to make the very best of their powers. It will not give you talents you were not born with, but will ensure that every talent you do possess is fully used, fully developed, fully brought to bear upon the work of your life. And in the end, that is what separates the person who realizes their potential from the one who carries it quietly to the grave, never having released it, Emerson captured this beautifully when he wrote of what happens when we hear great personal vigor, of great power performance in any person. We are suddenly and powerfully moved to fresh resolution. Something in us recognizes a quality and reaches toward it. Something responds, because we all carry will within us. All of us. The question is not whether it is there. The question is whether we have learned to use it. And the answer to that question is the business of this book, the persistent will. There is a particular quality of the positive will, one that Atkinson considers so important that he devotes an entire chapter to it alone. And that quality is persistence, not the great dramatic burst of will, not the single magnificent act of defiance or courage, not the one brilliant decision that changes everything in a moment. No, persistence is something quieter, something steadier, something far more rare and far more powerful than any of those. Persistence is the quality that keeps going, that holds on, that presses forward, not because the way is clear and victory is in sight, but precisely because the way is not clear and victory seems very far away indeed. Atkinson defines it with care. Steadfastness and firmness in carrying out the design, business, or course commenced or undertaken. Perseverance in the face of obstacles and discouragements. Steadfastness and determination in the face of opposition or hindrance. Stability, decision, perseverance. Fixedness of purpose, tenacity. These are the terms that cluster around persistent will. And then he adds a phrase that is simple but contains a world of practical truth. The will presses up close to the task, holds itself there firmly, and stays there until victory is won, not until it gets tired, not until others say it has done enough, not until conditions improve, until victory is won. Now, why does Atkinson place such extraordinary emphasis on persistence? Because he has observed, with great clarity, what actually defeats most people. And it is almost never what they think. Most people assume they were defeated by their rivals, by bad circumstances, by lack of money or lack of talent or lack of opportunity. And sometimes these things do play a role, but far more often than we realize, defeat comes not from outside but from within. It comes from the moment when a person, who was actually closer to victory than they knew, simply stopped. Success in many cases depends upon the capacity for holding on. Many people have fought brave fights, genuinely brave, genuinely committed fights, but lacking persistence, they let go just before the turn of the tide. They fell back, and they were defeated not by their rivals, not by circumstances, but by themselves. The person persistent will carries a different motto. When you feel that you must let go, hang on the harder, for victory is near. Harriet Beecher Stowe said it with the clarity of someone who knew. When you get into a tight place and everything goes against you until it seems you cannot hold on a minute longer, never give up then. For that is just the place and time that the tide will turn. An old proverb agrees. Success is endurance for one moment more. These are not pretty sentiments. They are hard truths, born out of hard experience. And the lives Atkinson now shows us prove them beyond any doubt. Think of Carlyle. He had spent years on his great history of the French Revolution, years of painstaking labor and careful research. Then, just before he was to take the manuscript to the printer, he left it on a table. A servant girl, not knowing what it was, threw it into the fire as waste paper. The work of years gone in minutes. Did Carlyle surrender? He did not. He recommenced the task. He rewrote the entire work. And the history of the French Revolution that stands today as a monument to his genius is also, and perhaps more profoundly, a monument to his persistence. Think of Audubon, the great naturalist, who spent years in the forests of America carefully drawing and coloring 200 plates of rare birds. 200 works of patient, precise, irreplaceable art. And then the mice found a portfolio one night, and in the morning the work of years was destroyed. He wrote afterward that a flame of anguish pierced his brain like an arrow of fire, and for several weeks he was prostrated with fever. The loss had nearly broken him, but physical and moral strength returned. He took up his gun and his portfolio and his pencils and plunged back into the depths of the forest. And the great work he eventually produced, Audubon's Birds of America, became one of the most celebrated and valuable works of art in American history. Think of Napoleon, who once walked to the banks of a river in Paris, in the grip of such despair and poverty that he decided to end his life as a failure. He stood at the edge, and then something in him stirred. Some reserve of persistence reached up from within and refused to let go. He walked away, filled, Atkinson tells us, with a new desire, a desire to live and conquer rather than die a failure. Days later, the army appointment he had been waiting for was granted. The world knows the rest. Think of Disraeli, later Lord Beaconsfield and Prime Minister of England, who stood up to make his first speech in Parliament and was hooted and hissed by the entire chamber until he was forced to sit down in humiliation. He was a Jewish man in an era of fierce prejudice, a young newcomer in a room full of men who did not want him there, and he turned and faced them, and he said with a quiet, bitter ferocity that no one in that room ever forgot, "You may silence me now and refuse to listen to me, but the time will come when I will make you hear me, and listen well to what I have to say." And he did. He went on to rule the very men who had hissed him. He bent them to his will. Think of Balzac, who wrote 40 novels in poverty before success found him. When his friends told him that in literature a man must be either a beggar or a king, he answered simply, "Very well, I will be a king." And he was. He stands today at the head of the list of French novelists. Think of Zola, who lived in a garret and went hungry for so long that he sometimes thought he must die of it. He went months without tasting meat. He lived for 2 days at a time on 3 apples. He could not afford a fire even on the coldest nights, and counted himself the happiest man in Paris when he could afford a candle to study by. And yet he persisted, and he became Zola. Think of Emerson, who once could not afford the 5 cents required to borrow the 2nd volume of a book he longed to read from the circulating library. But he lived to become Emerson, and years later he wrote these words, which carry in him every lesson of his long life. "I know no such unquestionable badge and ensign of the sovereign mind as that of tenacity of purpose, which, through all changes of companions or parties or fortunes, changes never, bates no jaw heart or hope, but wearies out opposition and arrives at its port." What a sentence that is. Wearies out opposition, not defeats it with a single brilliant stroke. Wearies it out, outlasts it, stays longer, holds firmer, simply refuses to stop until the way opens. Think of John Hunter, the famous anatomist, who could not read or write until he reached adulthood, and in spite of that handicap persisted, educated himself, and eventually climbed to the highest place in the profession in middle age. Think of Richard Arkwright, the cotton spinner who began as a barber and wig maker, who tinkered for years in great poverty with the idea of a spinning machine, who finally got his invention patented and perfected, only to find a mob rise against him as the inventor of a labor-saving machine, and the manufacturers refused to pay him the patent rights they owed him. And yet Arkwright persevered. He beat every combination that rose against him. At 50 years old, he sat down to study English grammar so that he could speak more correctly. He was eventually appointed High Sheriff of Derbyshire and was knighted before he died. Nothing could stop him. Nothing. Atkinson quotes a Yorkshire saying that captures all of this in 4 unforgettable words. It is dogged as does it, not brilliant as does it, not talented as does it, not lucky as does it. Dogged. That determined, relentless, steadfast holding on and sticking to it. That is what wins in the long run. That is what turns the tide. That is what converts apparent defeat into eventual, undeniable, permanent victory. A famous general was once described as a fool who never knew he was beaten, and who consequently held on until he wore out the enemy and won the final victory. There is something in that description that should ring true to every one of us. Not foolishness, exactly, but a refusal to accept that defeat is final, a kind of magnificent, stubborn, creative insistence that the story is not over yet, because it is the final victory that counts. 1,000 failures are forgiven and forgotten by the one who wins the final decisive struggle. Run over the list of those who have made good: Cyrus Field, Thomas Edison, Samuel Morse, Francis Willard, and all the others whose names history has preserved. In every instance, you will find the marked manifestation of persistent will. Without exception, without fail, persistence, Atkinson concludes, is one of the essential qualities of the positive will. Without it, a person may possess every virtue and every talent, and still will be and must be a failure, a mere flash in the pan of life. With it, with this one quality, this steady, unrelenting, unconquerable holding on, a person of modest talent and ordinary circumstances becomes capable of achieving things that the brilliant and the gifted who lack this quality can only stand back and marvel at. This is a persistent will, and it is available to every single one of us, right now, today, the moment we decide to claim it. The subconscious will. We have spoken of will as a conscious force, as a deliberate, directed, visible power of the mind pressing forward toward its chosen aim. We have seen it in the burning resolve of Palissy, in the stubborn persistence of Arkwright, in the defiant refusal of Disraeli to accept defeat. All of these are conscious expressions of will. The self, fully aware of itself, pressing its full force against the obstacles in its path. But will does not only operate in the daylight of conscious awareness. There is another dimension to will, one that Atkinson considers among the most important and most practically powerful discoveries of the new psychology. He calls it the subconscious will. Now, for the older school of psychologists, the very phrase unconscious was considered heresy, a contradiction in terms. Well, they insisted, was by its very nature a conscious operation of the mind. To speak of will working unconsciously was like speaking of a fire that gives no heat. It made no sense to them, but the science of psychology advanced. And what it uncovered in those previously unexplored regions beneath the surface of consciousness changed everything. Today, in Atkinson's time and far more so in ours, it is understood and accepted that a great proportion of the will activity of living creatures takes place in the subconscious regions of the mind. Go down the scale of life toward its simplest forms, and you find very little conscious awareness, but will activity in abundance. In higher animals and in human beings, The countless reflex actions, the deep running habits, the automatic movements that carry us through our days without demanding our conscious attention. All of these are expressions of operating along subconscious lines. And here is where something genuinely remarkable opens up. If we can operate along subconscious lines, if the deeper levels of the mind can be set to work, directed, and held to a task just as effectively as the conscious will holds the waking mind to its work, then we have access to a power far greater than anything we can summon through conscious effort alone. The principle that Atkinson points to here is that of autosuggestion, the deliberate use of suggestions given to oneself to arouse and direct the subconscious will. When a suggestion is properly impressed upon the mind, the subconscious will takes it up and holds the entire mental system to its execution, pressing the mind toward the desired state or goal, not only during waking hours, but during sleep, not only in moment of quiet reflection, but throughout the busy movements of the ordinary day. And the results that become possible through this faculty are, as Atkinson describes them, almost startling, because the subconscious will, once aroused and directed, does not only carry out simple behavioral tasks. It can be set to work on complex intellectual problems. You may carry a difficult question into the day. Turn your attention to other things, and return to find that the subconscious has worked it through in the background, and now presents a conscious mind with finished answer, clear, organized, ready to use. Or you may wake from sleep to find that some puzzle that resisted all conscious effort the night before has somehow been resolved in the deep hours of the night. Many of us have experienced this without knowing what it was. We set something aside that we could not solve and then found later that the answer simply appeared in our minds as if from nowhere. Or we returned to a problem and discovered that our minds had reorganized along lines we had not consciously planned. This is a subconscious will at work, and most of us have been allowing to operate randomly, by accident, when we could have been directing it deliberately. Atkinson introduces us here to Charles Godfrey Leland, who devoted serious study to this subject and wrote about it in a work called Have You a Strong Will, later republished as The Mystic Will. Leland's central claim is one of the most exciting in all of Atkinson's book, and it deserves to be heard fully. Leland writes that all mental faculties can, by direct scientific treatment, be influenced to what would once have been regarded as miraculous action, that the will can, by very easy processes of training and autosuggestion, be strengthened to any extent, and states of mind can be induced which become habitual through practice. A person can cause themselves, by a simple experiment, to remain during the following day in a perfectly calm or cheerful state of mind. And this condition can be varied and elevated through repetition and practice to states of far more active and intelligent description. The person who can develop their will in this way has it within their power not only to control their moral nature to any extent, but to call into action very extraordinary states of mind, faculties, talents, and abilities which they had never suspected to be within their reach. And then Leland says something that Atkinson considers one of the most important truths in the entire book. Something he says will bear much repetition, for it is highly important. He writes, "There lie hidden within us all, as in a sealed-up spiritual casket, or like the bottled-up spirit in an old tale, innumerable powers and intelligences, some capable of bestowing peace or calm, others of giving happiness, or inspiring creative genius, energy, and perseverance. All that people have ever attributed to some invisible world outside themselves lies, in fact, within them, and the magic key which will confer the faculty of sight and the power to conquer is the will." Think about what is being said here. Everything we have ever looked for outside ourselves, wisdom, calm, creative power, inspired intelligence, the ability to endure and persevere and ultimately triumph, all of it already exists within us. Sealed away, perhaps, dormant, perhaps, but present, real, accessible through the deliberate development and direction of the will. This is not a mystical claim. Leland is at pains to make clear that his approach is practical and intelligible, that it does not require any high philosophical position, only a willingness to try a simple, well-defined method. And the method, as Leland describes it, is this: not to will or resolve too vehemently, but simply and very gently, yet persistently, to impress the desired idea upon the mind, not with tension and struggle, not with gritted teeth and clenched fists, but with a calm, quiet, assured sense of what is to be, as a thing already decided, already underway, already on its way to completion, before going to sleep, or in any moment of mental quietude during the waking day. Simply and coolly make up your mind that a thing will be done. Do not desire it sternly or forcibly. Do not strain and push against it. Simply, calmly resolve. And then let the subconscious will take the instruction and carry it forward into the hours ahead. Leland illustrates this with 3 vivid physical examples, and they are worth dwelling on because once you have understood them, you will never forget the principle they illustrate. If you wish to ring a doorbell and produce as much sound as possible, you would naturally pull it back as far as you could and let it go. But if at the moment of releasing it, you give it just a small extra tap with your finger, you will actually double the sound. A tiny additional impulse at the right moment creates a disproportionately large effect. If you wish to shoot an arrow as far as possible, it is not enough to simply draw the bow to its fullest tension and release. If, at the very moment of release, you give the bow a quick push forward, even a light and seemingly trivial push, the arrow will fly nearly twice as far as it would have gone without it. And in the art of wielding a sharp saber, the draw cut is everything. If, to the downward blow, you add a simultaneous slight pull along the blade, you can cut through a silk handkerchief or through far harder materials that a plain chopping blow would leave untouched. The tap on the bell, the push on the bow, the draw on the saber, all 3 are examples of a small, precise, well-timed additional impulse that dramatically multiplies the power of what is already in motion. And this, Leland tells us, is exactly what forethought does, what the deliberate directing of the subconscious will does. When applied to the coming work of the mind or the life, it is more than merely thinking about what you are going to do. It is a deliberate bidding of the deeper self to fulfill a task, the calm, clear, confident projection of the will forward into the work ahead, a kind of mental advance order, sent down into the subconscious before the conscious mind turns to other things, that sets the whole deeper machinery of the mind in motion toward the desired result. Gymnasts know this. Marksmen know this. Athletes who perform at the highest levels know that in the moment before action, something is sent ahead, some projection of intention and confidence that arrives at the target before the body follows. The aim of the great rifle shot seems infallible, not simply because of strength of nerve or sharpness of sight, but because something in him, some directing principle independent of both, is already there. Atkinson is clear about what this all means for us, practically. In the later parts of this book, devoted to the development of will, he will combine these methods of arousing the subconscious with the more familiar methods of conscious will training. Because the full development of will requires that every phase of its activity be considered and every effective method be employed. The new psychology is pragmatic. It cares less about theory than about practice. Less about what will is and about how to develop it, direct it, and use it. Not just the conscious will that everyone can see, but the deeper, quieter, vastly more powerful subconscious will that lies waiting beneath the surface of every human mind. And the key to that deeper power is simpler than most people imagine. Not force, not effort, not strain. Simply know what you want. Give it your full, fixed, earnest attention. Take a real interest in it. And then calmly, gently, with quiet certainty, send the order down and trust the will within you to carry it forward. And so we close part 2 of this magnificent journey through the power of the human will. What William Walker Atkinson has given us in this section is not merely inspiration, though there is inspiration here in abundance, in the story of Palissy burning his furniture in pursuit of a dream, in the stories of Disraeli and Balzac and Audubon, and all those magnificent, stubborn, unconquerable souls who refuse to be stopped. He has given us something more than inspiration. He has given us a framework, a way of understanding what the will is truly capable of when it is fully awakened and fully used. The resolute will that does not flinch from sacrifice, that burns the furniture if the furniture must be burned, that endures reproach and poverty and sleeplessness and ridicule and keeps the fires going anyway, because it knows what it is reaching for and will not stop short of it. The persistent will that holds on one moment longer than seems possible, that wearies out opposition rather than overpowering it, that treats every defeat as a temporary condition and every setback as simply one more step on the road to the final, decisive, irreversible victory. And the subconscious will, that deep, quiet, endlessly available power that lies within every one of us, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be directed, waiting to carry us further and faster and deeper than conscious effort alone could ever take us. If you carry nothing else forward from this recording, carry this. The power that built the lives of all those extraordinary men and women that Atkinson has shown us today. That power is not different in kind from the power that exists in you. It is the same will, the same fire, the same capacity for resolve, for persistence, for quiet subconscious mastery. The only question is whether you choose to develop it. What you have heard today is part 2 of this 3-part work. Part 3, the final and most practically powerful section, is waiting for you on our channel right now. In it, Atkinson moves from the power of will into its active development. He gives you the methods, the exercises, the step-by-step practices for building the will into a force that will transform every area of your life. Go to our channel now and listen to part 3. Everything you have heard in parts 1 and 2 has been preparing you for what comes next. And if this recording has stirred something real in you, if the stories of Palissy and the ideas of Leland and the whole great vision of what human will become have moved you in any way, please take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber allows us to bring more of these timeless, transforming voices to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe now. Share this with someone who is in the middle of a fight. They are thinking of giving up,